Welcome to the Blue Collar Millionaire Show. I am your host, Chad Hufford, and this is the podcast where we celebrate the unsung heroes of the working world. Each week, we dive into the incredible stories of honest, hardworking folks who have found financial success through grit, determination, and good old-fashioned elbow grease. So if you're ready to be inspired and learn how to turn your hard work into your own success story, you're in the right place. This is the Blue Collar Millionaire Show.
Ben in Minnesota gave us an Amazon review. Awesome book, seriously. I can easily relate to the flow, style, and bright humor present all throughout. One of the most solid books I've read on personal finance and performance psychology in a while. And I read a ton, Ben says. Pretty awesome review we just got.
That's cool.
Down there in Minnesota. That's a good segue, actually, because we're talking about farming. And there's a lot of farmers in Alaska that have come from Minnesota. So chapter 5, we're gonna get into here in a bit on the Blue Collar Millionaire Show. Chapter 5 of your book, Forging Financial Freedom. This chapter is called Farm Your Orchard. This is a metaphor that you use a lot when describing investments. Honestly, I'm curious to know, when did you start using this metaphor of an orchard?
It's actually developed over time because initially I used it for two main purposes. One was for the permanence. This idea that an orchard is something that is long lasting and enduring, something that could sustain you and your family for a very long period of time. But then it also fit well in the context of the time and patience required to allow the orchard to grow. Like, trees don't grow overnight. This isn't about getting rich quick. It's about building wealth slowly and nurturing and planting those seeds well in advance of when you're going to need them. And the proactive planning and activities necessary to have that orchard serve you 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Now, since then, I've developed that even more, and we use to talk about diversification and volatility and a lot of different things, but just to get this mindset of also something more tangible too, that we don't have, these aren't just stock certificates or something. We own something that is producing a fruit, in this case income, but producing fruit that does sustain us, and it carries forward, and then we have a legacy to pass on potentially to our kids, and that's the orchard itself. But unlike a bond or something like that, where you're actually just lending to a company, when you are in growth stock mutual funds, you actually own the companies. You own the thing that's producing the income. So you can pass along those ownership rights, but still be able to live off of years and years and years of income. We talked about this before in the show, how financial independence is an income issue, not a principal problem. And I think the orchard just is a tangible metaphor for what that looks like.
Yeah. And as we've talked about, we'll get into it later on in this show. But it's a powerful thing, because we're riding through some storms, but we're also being able to benefit from that fruit. You talk about in this chapter, with an orchard, you are farming, you're not gambling. And it's not getting rich quick. Neither of us are farmers, but we know some farmers, and it's not something where you're going to just build a farm and then suddenly a few months later you're super wealthy.
Well, and part of the idea as it comes to the longevity of this too, it isn't about how much the trees are worth at any given time.
Right.
The objective of the farmer is to maximize or optimize the production of fruit over their lifetime. So as a farmer, you're not concerned about, if I dig up all my trees this week, how much can I get for them? Or, hey, there's a storm cloud on the horizon. Let's dig up our trees. We'll pull them into the garage, pull them into the underneath the tent, and then we'll plant them when it's bright and sunny again. Like, that's crazy.
Right.
And people realize that. Like, you don't have to know much about farming. That probably doesn't work. You're uprooting everything. But people uproot their financial strategies all the time because of what they see on the horizon. So our mindset here is to farm an orchard, to nurture your investment strategy in the way that they are rooted to withstand the storms, not trying to pull our investments back and forth in and out of the storm, trying to miss it, or to to get out of the rain when things get a little bit stormy.
Just to make sure that this is a very clear picture for anyone listening. When you say like uprooting your trees, or in this case, uprooting your investments, what does that mean? What does that look like to uproot your investments?
It can
Most likely it means what?
Well, it can go a few different ways. Usually I would say it's in panic. People are like, oh, there's somebody on the news, or a lot of people on the news maybe, talking about something on the horizon. And again, I mentioned the book, we mentioned on the podcast. There's always a storm cloud on the horizon. It might hit us, it might not, but even if it does, we need to be invested in a way to withstand the storm, not to miss it. So, but what this looks like oftentimes is people want to pull their investments out of companies, hold it in cash or maybe bonds or something like that. They usually don't take it out of their retirement accounts, but they take it out of the companies that they used to own, waiting until the storm passes. But the problem with that is once one storm passes, there's going to be another one on the horizon, or maybe two or three. I mean, right now, even as we're recording, we're talking about tariff stuff. We're talking about war in the Middle East and Iran, all these different things. Meanwhile, there's inflation stuff in the back. There will always be a storm cloud. It may never reach us, but even if it does, if we're invested properly, again, you're planting an orchard, the trees are going to get wet sometime. That's okay.
And if I'm uprooting my investments, no matter which way it exactly looks, in essence, the principle that we're talking about is basically I'm kind of stuffing my money under the mattress because it's safe, because I'm scared of volatility. I'm scared.
Yeah, you're pulling all your trees up and you're putting them under a tarp because you don't want them in the storm. But that's not how you're going to get your orchard to grow long term. The other way this could look too is you've got this orchard, and it's got all different types of trees. And you got cherries and oranges, apples and avocados. And I realize this is where this breaks down, because you wouldn't have all those things growing necessarily in the same climate. But that's the beauty of mutual funds, is you can have a wide variety of companies in one account. But let's say avocados are shooting the lights out. You're like, okay, we're going to dig up all of our pear trees and plum trees and cherry trees and plant avocados, because the avocados are super hot right now. So what inevitably happens is you uproot all these trees, which will come in season eventually, maybe not be in season now. They'll come in season eventually. And you've bought more trees at a premium, whatever is most expensive, planting them in that place. So it could very much look like panicking, pulling your trees out to get them somewhere safe, which isn't safe at all, but it's comfortable in the moment, or potentially chasing fads. Like we're not, the growth we're seeing is not acceptable because there's one part of my orchard that is growing super fast. So I want to replace all those trees with that one variety of tree.
So could that look like, and I'll just use a really basic or maybe a really broad example, but if it's like tech is booming, and so I'm going to get all my investments into tech, whatever that means, and because that's what's hot.
Yep.
And so that's the thing.
And you're sacrificing the rest of your orchard, likely selling off some of your trees at a relative discount to buy something else at a premium. And again, this goes back to the idea of farming, where there's a wild difference between somebody who is buying investments based on what they need for the next 30, 40 years, and somebody who's buying investments based on how much they think they can sell those investments for in the next few years.
Trying to flip them.
Yeah, we're not tree salesmen, we're farmers.
Yeah, it's powerful.
But people don't think about that. They think I'm investing for the long run, just like I'm farming for the next 40 years, but they're so worried about the temporary price of the trees that they're digging them up, and they end up flipping trees. They become tree traders or tree salesmen instead of actually long-term investors. And again, it's easy to see how silly that looks in this context, but we do the exact same thing with our mutual funds, our long-term investments. We end up trading them to try to maximize the temporary price fluctuation, or maybe not experience the temporary price fluctuation, but we end up trading them instead of investing. And trading investments is the antithesis of being a long-term investor.
So another example you give in this chapter that in the farming metaphor seems really goofy, seems absurd, and yet there's an obvious reason why you give it, because how it ties in with finances. So you talk about, you wouldn't, instead of having an orchard with hundreds or thousands of trees, you wouldn't just plant one gigantic tree or even 5 gigantic trees. Give us, I mean, the breakdown, what that looks
So
like.
we had this just happened, I think it was last week. We had somebody come in, and we have a really cool piece of software that kind of analyzes somebody's portfolio. It basically strips the wrappers off your various mutual funds to show what you actually own inside there.
Okay.
To see, are we well diversified? Are we buying maybe the same companies over and over again, but just with a different wrapper or essentially packaging around them? And this individual had about 2,000 companies in their portfolio. So it appeared to be very diversified.
Yeah.
But over 20% of the value was in 3 companies.
Wow.
So even though they owned a couple thousand, really what they had was 3 huge trees and then a bunch of tiny saplings. So if anything happens to those trees, their orchard starts crumbling because they don't really have an orchard. They have 3 gigantic trees.
And just to be clear, there's not anything wrong with those companies in this example, right? It's just you've got so much equity tied up in.
And if you go back to that,
few.
you go back to that farming example, you want to be dependent on no particular tree. You don't even want to be overly dependent on any particular variety or species of tree, but certainly no one tree should make or break your crop this year, next year, or any year. And the problem with getting overly concentrated is you're no longer farming an orchard. You're trying to protect just a handful of trees. It may not be 3, it might be 10, it might be 15, but we see how, that you wouldn't drive by an orchard and see, some 400-foot apple tree and then a whole bunch of like normal ones, and the farmer has a fence around it,
right.
And he's reading to them and talking to them at night, and all his energy is going to those half a dozen trees. But can very easily happen in our portfolios without us even knowing it. And we buy different funds and we keep buying the same companies over and over again. And then that's when our orchard starts becoming very concentrated, either around one idea, maybe one type of company or one industry, or it might even be just a handful of very specific companies.
Use the Nick Murray quote that we're never going to own enough of any one thing to make a killing, which means we're also not going to own enough of any one thing to get killed by it. Which again, you use that example with trees. It sounds crazy to have the giant tree, and yet if all my retirement is in Apple stock or one industry or whatever, that wisdom starts to pour through. Another thing you talk about in this chapter is that we're not trying to, these are my words, but like we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or beat our neighbors' investments as if it's like this zero-sum game. Like we got to be the best investor in the world. We're trying to capture the market.
There's a lot of emphasis and energy placed on beating the market, whatever that means. It means different things to different people, because there's dozens of different indices out there. It could be large U.S. companies. It could be small U.S. companies. It might be an international index. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that the Dow is only 30 companies. That's not an orchard. It's just 30 huge trees.
So when people say the Dow is up, the Dow is down,
it's 30 companies. So that's relatively arbitrary. We're just picking a subset of companies that we've been able to build a kind of a fence around and say they fit together for some reason. Mm-hmm. It's like the old Sesame Street thing. Which one of these doesn't belong? Like there's some way to categorize these together that makes sense, either because their size, their industry, their geographical region, whatever. Yeah. But it's an arbitrary set of companies, even if there's criteria. And a lot of times we measure the performance of our trees based off of somebody's relatively arbitrary subset of trees, a financial index. And they worry about beating an index more than they worry about keeping up with their long-term financial goals. So let's just say that we have 2 investments and we choose an index, could be the Dow, and you overperform the index by 2%, which would be massive, 2 percentage points over the next 20 years. And I underperform it by 2%. Also massive. I mean, companies spend billions of dollars to try to get a fraction of a percent of return out of this. But if that means that I'm broke on a park bench at 75 and you're not broke on a park bench till 80, but at 81, we're both trying to rub nickels together to stay warm, we didn't keep up with our long-term goals.
Right.
And that so often is the focus. People are so concerned with beating the market. Number one, that they miss their long-term objectives. Number two, they probably underperform their own investments. Because when you are chasing an index, there will always be another index that is more localized, more specific, and will for a season outperform whatever you own. So when you talk about being diversified, never owning enough of any one thing to make a killing, you're giving up the chance for your portfolio to lead all those other things.
So if somebody has $100,000 IRA that's valued at $100,000, they're not likely to wake up tomorrow and it's valued at $500,000 or $1 million.
Yeah.
But it's also not likely to wake up and it's worth nothing. So when it comes to diversification, are you essentially trying to have different types of companies and different types of industries just for the sake of being different, or is there strategy that goes into the differences?
So you want companies that complement each other. So going back to the orchard, you don't want everything coming in and out of season at the same time.
Okay.
You don't want everything flying in formation. Now, sometimes most of the companies, or a lot of them, will go up together. Sometimes they might go down, but they're going to react to economic environments differently. When interest rates change, when taxes change, when trade regulations change, when wars happen, when inflation moves one direction or the other, you don't want everything acting and reacting the same way. So the idea is being strategic to have different types of companies that come in and out of season based off of different environmental factors. I say environmental, we talk about economic factors, and we don't know how they're going to react necessarily. We just know that historically, small companies react differently than large companies. Growth companies react differently than value companies. Kind of tying that back into the orchard metaphor, peaches, pears, plums, limes, bananas, like they're going to all come in out of season. Some are going to do better if there's an extra wet season. Some are going to do better if there's if the season's extra dry. And the metaphor breaks down as you could probably predict that with fruit. You can't predict that with companies, but it's the idea of not everything is going to turn the same way, which can also be frustrating because you might have some investments that are shooting the lights out while some of your other companies are kind of bleeding quietly into the carpet. And that's just something you have to accept as an investor, that you're not always going to own what's working best at that particular time.
Yeah.
But what you own has always worked. And I tell people this on a weekly basis. I'm not so concerned about how much your investments are worth at any given moment, today, tomorrow, next week. I also am not concerned about any relative short-term performance. What I do care about is beginning the day that you plan on retiring, or at least stepping into a work optional lifestyle, that your investments produce enough income to sustain you every month for the rest of your life. It's not about how much they're worth. It's how much income they can produce. And if we have 10,000 different companies, I'm just using that as a random number, but it's relatively accurate, 10,000 different companies paying your paycheck in retirement, you can see how that's way more robust than most of that income coming from maybe a dozen companies.
Right. And you going back to that example you give, if you ask a farmer, what each tree on his orchard is worth at that moment, or how many branches are on each tree, he's gonna be like, what are you talking about? Because he doesn't know, because it doesn't matter. So one more part of this metaphor is the idea of storms, right? That a farmer is not worried that a storm may come. He knows that storms will come, right? Because it's not a 30-day or 6-month farm. It's a decade, multi-decade, multi-generational farm. So storms will come. He's going to respond. He's going to prepare, right? Some of the storms, and you lay out in the book, and of course, I can't lay it out visually the way you have it in the books. People just have to open up chapter 5, but you list a bunch of storms. And it's not to minimize. I mean, these are real things that, well, for the most part, real things that had very real impact. But everything from 9/11, Brexit, COVID, right? Now, if you did a revision and you could add tariffs, right? I mean, all these different things, and people get freaked out because the news cycle, and you open up your phone first thing in the morning, last thing before you go to bed, and all this stuff is flooding. Talk a little bit about that, of these storms are going to hit.
Well, let's just kind of go back to the orchard first. If you use that metaphor, there's always a storm cloud on the horizon. You don't know how bad it's going to be, if it's going to hit, or what the consequences might be. But when they do hit, it is uncomfortable. If you're a farmer watching your orchard as wind is whipping your trees back and forth, and sometimes a few branches break off, a couple trees might even die. Again, it goes back to the point of diversification, not having enough invested in any one part of your orchard that you can be really hurt by the effects of that storm. But it's going to be noisy. It's going to be scary. It's going to be hard to watch. But you just have to have faith that the vast majority of your trees will not only survive the storm, but will probably thrive. And when it comes to financial storms, you mentioned some of them. I mean, we've had, even go back further, the banking crisis in 2008, 2009, the tech stock bursting in 2000, 9/11, going back to some of the oil embargo stuff in the 70s. S&P 500 has been cut in half 3 times in the last 50 years or so. All of those storms had real events going on. It wasn't just what was happening. There were scary things. And with COVID, we weren't just worried about a recession and financial things. People were worried about their health and my kids gonna be able to go back to school and things like that. So all of these storms have very real fears surrounding them, but we have to be able to look past that, realizing this too shall pass. So what people often say on the news is this time is different. There's something about this storm that is going to fundamentally destroy your orchard. And if your orchard is well constructed, well diversified, and you don't uproot your trees, you have to have faith. You don't know how it's going to end. You don't know when it's going to end. You just know that the storm will end. This too shall pass. And you will be much better served withstanding and persevering through the storm than trying to time it, when to pull your trees out and when to plant them back again.
Because if I understand you correctly, you're not relying on you as an investor being a financial genius. You're relying on I'm investing in thousands of incredibly successful and innovative companies that are really good at figuring out how to turn profits.
And just, this is not a recommendation for people to invest in the S&P 500 because it's only large US companies. It's by itself not super well diversified. But if we use that as an example, if you put $100,000 in, 51 years ago, 1973, the peak of the market, right before it got cut in half, it'd be arguably one of the worst times to invest.
Okay.
Right before a 50% decline. And you did nothing. You just planted those seeds.
You just left it there.
Left it, let it grow. You would have had the value of your orchard cut in half 3 different times. About 14 or 15 times you would have the value of your orchard cut by 20% or more. The average decline in any given year, the temporary value of the companies themselves, just the price of the trees, about 15%. You have weathered dozens of minor storms, 10 or more pretty significant storms, 3 catastrophic storms. And that 100,000, if you had weathered each one, would be worth roughly $20 million today.
And I'm being completely serious. Like I've heard you share that before. And yet when you break down the different storms and the how many times it's getting sliced in half, how many times it's going down 20%, the human in me, emotionally, it feels like I'm probably not gonna have any money.
Yeah, like what kind of moron would invest
in
something
like that?
That
these storms are literally tearing my orchard to shreds, and I'm left with just some rubble. And it would be 20 million.
Yeah, and who would sign up for that? Like, right. Okay, so over 50 years, it's going to cut in half 3 times. Every 4 or 5 years, it's going to be cut by 20% or more. Every year, there's going to be a cut about 15%. If you, what? Yeah, who would do that? Why? Why would do that? Well, there's 20 million reasons why. But you have to survive those storms. So going back to your point, it doesn't take a lot of intelligence. It takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of planning. It takes grit. So these are character qualities more than intellectual ability. So we don't need to be the smartest, brightest financial minds with the most updated information. Right. What we do have to be is like a gritty old Midwestern farmer who's going to go out there and do the hard work and realize that there will be a price to pay, a temporary price to pay along the way. There'll be some scary storms. He'll get wet sometimes, but that orchard can grow to sustain his family. Like you said, that multi-generational value that an orchard can bring.
I want to end with a quote from the book. And this also calls back to a recent episode we did talking about various terms where we use them just as a society in the financial industry. These terms get used in a really wrong way. The idea of risk. You talk about if you think investing is risky, wait until you get the bill for not investing. The real threats to your future. Everything that you just described, but all these storms hitting, that sounds incredibly risky. Like, why on earth would I do that? Why don't I just build a really strong tree and just protect that one tree, right? Or just do something else, stick my money under the mattress. And yet the real risk would be not investing in some of the best companies on earth over a long period of time.
Yeah. If you want to take that step further, it'd be like, well, it's too scary to have these trees out there. So I'm just going to keep them in a greenhouse. They're not going to get very big,
right?
And they're not going to be able to sustain your family. That's not in the book. That's just that's bonus material.
Not going to die, but I'm not getting any fruit.
Yeah. So your trees are never going to be in storm, they're never going to get wet, but they're never going to be able to sustain you. And yeah, the risk in owning companies, or the risk around companies, is really not owning them, or owning them and choosing to turn your back and run away the moment the storm hits, or the moment the storm looks like it might hit, which is almost constantly.
Appreciate you taking the time to go through this chapter 5. This is one of my favorite chapters. I love the tangible examples. That it always helps. Maybe I'm not as smart as some people. I need the metaphors. I need the tangible examples. So it helps me. And guys, for anyone that is listening, if anyone's watching, just don't panic. Don't chase the hot new thing, and don't wait to start building your orchard. Farm your orchard. It's a long-term thing.
Thanks for listening to the Blue Collar Millionaire Show. We hope this episode has been inspiring and beneficial to you. If you want help on your journey to financial freedom, reach out to us at veritasalaska.com. We'd love to sit down over a cup of coffee with you, either here in our office or virtually, and get to know you and your needs. And though this podcast is free of charge, we do ask that you please do us 2 quick favors. If you enjoyed the episode, give our pod a great rating on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you use, and also give us a follow on Instagram. We hope you have a wonderful day filled with gratitude and intentionality. God bless.